I know what I should love to do, to build a study, to write, and to think of nothing else. I want to bury myself in a den of books. I want to saturate myself with the elements of which they are made and breathe their atmosphere until I'm of it. With these words, General Lew Wallace gave voice to a long-held dream to build what he called the pleasure house of my soul, a study where the Civil War general, 19th century Renaissance man, and world-famous author could, and again I quote, rest in and grow reminiscent, fighting the battles of youth over again. And it's really no wonder he needed a rest after a career of over half a century of service to the United States. The study stands today much as it did when Wallace designed and built it as a quiet place of retirement. Lew Wallace was not the only Renaissance man associated with the study. There was, of course, Bohumir Kryl, a talented young man who sculpted the elaborate stone carvings on the building. This work, just a few blocks from where we stand tonight, which was commissioned by General Wallace, is truly the first enduring legacy of Bohumir Kryl. Before devoting our evening to Kryl's career, a few words about Lew Wallace. He was born in Brookville, Indiana in 1827. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Wallace was appointed Adjutant General for the state of Indiana, where he helped to organize 13 volunteer regiments from the state in just 13 days before resigning and accepting commission as a colonel of the 11th Indiana Volunteer Infantry. At the age of 34, he earned the rank of Major General, becoming the youngest Major General in the Union Army. In 1862, Wallace commanded troops at Forts Henry and Donelson and also at Shiloh. He also prevented the Confederate capture of Cincinnati without a battle. General Wallace was widely lauded for saving the city of Washington, D.C. in 1864 by leading his greatly outnumbered regiment in a delaying action at Monocacy Junction, Maryland. After the war, Wallace served as second in command of the courts-martial for the trial of the Lincoln assassination conspirators, and this was followed as president of the court-martial of Henry Wirz, the commander at the infamous prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia. Wallace later fought against Emperor Maximilian in Mexico. He then served as governor of the New Mexico Territory, helping to bring Billy the Kid to justice, and from 1881 to 1885, he was the U.S. minister to the Ottoman Empire. But long before he retired, Wallace began to write. Wallace's literary reputation rests on 7 books, actually 6.5. He died halfway through his last book, his autobiography. But his writings include 3 novels: The Fair God, which was published in 1873, The Prince of India, which was published in 1893, and of course, Ben-Hur in 1880, which truly was the right book at the right time. Ben-Hur became the best-selling book of the 19th century. It outsold Uncle Tom's Cabin, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and even Charles Dickens' individual novels, so it was an impressive work of art. Ben-Hur has never been out of print and has never ceased being part of America's culture. The stirring story of Judah Ben-Hur was made into a wildly successful Broadway play in 1899 that ran for over 20 years on Broadway and was seen by almost 20 million people. Movie versions of the story were made in 1907, 1925, and 1959. Wallace was also a gifted artist whose paintings, sketches, and sculptures traveled the country during his lifetime, and some of these are on display even today over at the study, just a few blocks from here. He played the violin, and even learned to build them in a workshop in his basement. He was also an inventor and held 8 U.S. patents. General Wallace died on February 15, 1905, and he's buried just north of town here in Oak Hill Cemetery. Built in the 1890s, the general study and grounds were maintained and kept open to the public by the Wallace family until the late 1930s, when the property was closed. In 1941, a far-sighted local organization called the Community House for Women purchased the property from his grandson, and they presented it to the city of Crawfordsville, which holds it to this day. The general spared no expense in the creation of this pleasure house for his soul. He used the finest materials and craftsmen available in its design and execution. Over the last 2 years that we've been working on the study, new discoveries have heightened its significance. The discovery of the original elaborate interior paint finishes was one important addition to improving our understanding of the history of this basically Victorian man cave. The rediscovery of Bohumir Kryl over the last year and a half as a multifaceted artist and accomplished museum has truly been another extraordinary adventure. It's actually nice to let your imagination run and contemplate how this curly-haired young bohemian at the beginning of his career interacted with the old general who was nearing the end of his career in the 1890s. They must have recognized each other's shared creative talents, and tonight we hope to share some of that creativity with you. If you will join me in welcoming to the stage Richard Bowen as Bohumir Kryl. His wife Eileen Bowen will be our historical document narrator, and Tim McCormick will perform his duties playing the original Kryl music, acoustic recordings for your enjoyment. So thank you very much.
Good evening, my dear ladies and gentlemen, fellow lovers of all things musical, and fellow lovers of these ingenious musical contraptions that grant us immortality. I do not mean this figuratively, by the way. I was born a very long time ago in 1875. My name is Bohumir Kryl, and yes, we are here tonight to celebrate me. And about time, don't you think? No, you do not mean it. Tonight we are here to honor, to listen to, and to play some of my music. For this singular opportunity, we owe our thanks to the magic of musical notation, to the beauty and durability of musical instruments, and most of all, to the genius of one man. No, I am not referring to myself at the moment. I am referring to the great Thomas Edison, who often said that the phonograph was his favorite invention. I cannot disagree. Edison invented the tinfoil phonograph in 1877. Durable wax cylinders soon replaced the foil ones, and by the end of the 1890s, phonograph players were showing up in private homes. And the rest, as they say, is history. How many of you own a device that plays music? Raise your hands. My goodness, my great-great-grandchildren tell me that they have 10 or more such dynamos in their homes, some of which can be carried around for private enjoyment. Goodness, the world does move on. But think for a moment about the start of my century, the 20th century. Unless you were fortunate enough to live in a community frequented by superior musicians, your exposure to professional music talent could come only from phonograph recordings. And what a fortuitous invention it was. I recorded for Thomas Edison, for the Victor Talking Machine Company, for Pathé, for Zonophone, for Columbia, and for many others, making it possible these many decades later for you to know me and my art. My breath passing into my cornet still sounds as lovely in this hall as it did the day I played it into the recording horn in Edison's studio. Yes, we will get to one of those records in just a moment. Perhaps you will be hearing it for the first time. Certainly I am not as much in fashion as I once was, and I was very much in fashion, as you will see. My cornet performances still live through my recordings and through these wonderful musicians who honor me tonight. You will want to listen carefully to my virtuoso performance skills in playing the most difficult cornet solos, which I assure you were just about the most popular musical entertainment in America during my early career. In those days, I played to very educated audiences. Back in 1900, a well-rounded education included instruction in the arts. Most everyone learned to play a musical instrument or was trained to develop his or her voice. Such a quaint notion. I love to play the cornet, and I've heard that even today, 135 years after my birth, accomplished cornet players still listen to my recorded legacy in awe and admiration. Perhaps you will agree with their assessment. Not bad, huh? No, you do not mean it. Thank you all. Let us back up a bit. We are here tonight in what may seem an unlikely place, Crawfordsville, Indiana. But this little city is not at all an unlikely spot to me. As a young man freshly come to these American shores from Europe, Crawfordsville was the place of opportunity. With no inkling of what the future would hold for an eager 21-year-old, I came west from New York just over 100 years ago and met one of the nation's great men, an Army officer, a statesman, an author, and a world traveler. You know him, yes? His name was General Lew Wallace. He said he needed a stone sculptor, and that skill I could provide. I first learned the trade in my native Bohemia and had recently studied with a master sculptor in Chicago. During the summer of 1896, with my water sluice close at hand, I set my chisels and rifflers to stone and completed, following H.R. Saunders' designs, the many friezes and faces for the general study. If I say so for myself, it was and is still a handsome piece of work. Go over to the Lew Wallace Study and Museum and have a look. When one is making a bid for immortality, you see, it helps to diversify. I was also hired to do carving work in Indianapolis on the monumental structure known as the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. It was about this time that John Philip Sousa's band came to town, and I immediately found a new job as his first cornetist. During my teen years and early 20s, I was a knockabout stone sculptor, traveling to wherever there was work. I suppose you could say that when I was with the Sousa band, we did the same thing, but I was hardly laboring in obscurity there. In fact, I quickly advanced to top billing status. Friends, I received as much as $1,000 per performance, a weighty sum for a young man from Bohemia just following the crowd to America to make a new life. If that was not enough, phonographs were just first appearing in family parlors. And ladies and gentlemen, though it may seem immodest to admit it, those families wanted to listen to me. You surely know of P.T. Barnum, of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and the great traveling shows of Ben-Hur based on General Wallace's book. Well, my friends, that's the way it was in those years. We had to make our names known. We had to bring the delights of music to the smallest towns out on the prairies. We needed to be lighted up by the brightest lights in the biggest cities. This, as you know, is how civilization spreads. And I'm not shy to say how hard I worked to help music, especially my music, become widely known. Those were the great days of realizing the American dream, and I was one of those self-made men. In order for you to see how my life unfolded onto this golden path, paved with musical scores, we might say, I need to take you back even farther to my origins, so you can see how one man's individual spirit and energy can help to shape a country. General Wallace knew all about that, and I was quick to learn it as well. I was born 10 years after the end of the American Civil War in 1875 in a little town near the great city of Prague in what is now part of the Czech Republic. We Bohemians are a very proud people with a history traceable back to the 8th century. But at the time I was born, and up until the Great War, my little town of Horis was part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. In those days of my youth, a great many people from our area immigrated to the United States, hoping for a richer, more open life. The Kryl family was a part of this exodus. My parents, Jan and Josefa Kryl, had 6 children. We shipped out for the United States at various times. My father, too, was trained as a sculptor and practiced that trade in Bohemia. 2 of my brothers and I learned the rudiments of that skill while we were growing up in the old country. I have to say that even before coming to America, I was a restless child. I began taking violin lessons at age 10, but I was also smitten with the excitement of the big top, And when I was only 11, I ran away from home to join a circus. Oh, how we Europeans loved our circuses, and I learned so much there. I became a tumbler and often doubled on the high trapeze. Someone in the troupe had a cornet, which I picked up and began playing in the street parades we presented when our circus came to town. A painful accident, tumbling is not without its risks, you know, laid me low for some time, but the way my face and sinuses healed may have given me the rare ability to do what many people think of as a circus trick. I was able to perform the feat of circular breathing, which was a real benefit to my cornet playing, but I became best known for my ability to triple tongue. Thank you. In 1889, when I was only 14, I had accumulated enough money to be allowed to book passage on a boat to America, though I did need to work for my keep on the crossing by playing both violin and cornet. This was so successful that once I had been processed through Ellis Island, I pulled out my cornet on the train trip from New York and Chicago and played for the passengers. Each time I passed my hat, it came back full. I joined my family in Chicago, but it was not quite the land of opportunity we had imagined. Once I described to a magazine editor that time of family struggle when I was new in America, which was recently reprinted in the magazine In the Groove. I will ask my friend Eileen to tell you about it. I believe my description of these early events is what's known as making a silk purse out of a sow's ear.
From the Cincinnati Times-Star, July 9, 1908. My father's family moved every month and didn't pay rent for a whole year. You see, we would just get settled in our new flat, and I would start my practicing. When the neighbors would begin to complain and go to the landlord, he would get us to move. Of course, he couldn't make us move until the end of the month, and we would then leave. Having had notice to get out, we wouldn't have to pay rent. My father had an express van hired for the year. In that year, we moved exactly 12 times. As a premium for getting out of the flat, he was allowed to go without paying rent. In my life, except for 4 or 5 weeks when I had typhoid fever, I have never gone a day without practicing.
Yes, I did love my horn, but it would be a few more years before my playing provided a secure livelihood. Still, by the time I was 21, I was well launched. I had a beautiful wife and 2 splendid daughters who made me very happy. I also had an occupation in the arts, just not quite the art that fully captured my passion. Writing a few years later, a reporter for the Crawfordsville Journal chronicled the steps that finally took me to the promised land.
July 11th, the Crawfordsville Journal, 1907. Those who have had the pleasure of a visit to the late General Lew Wallace's study will recall the statue of Ben-Hur, which occupies a prominent place there, and also other busts and ornaments in stone and plaster. It is of interest to know that the designer of these is now a bandmaster and directing the music at the well-known Indianapolis resort called Fairbank. His name is Bohumir Kryl, and he is a Bohemian by birth, born in Prague on the Moldau 32 years ago. I came to the United States when 14 years old, said Mr. Kryl, and settled at Chicago, where I studied sculpture with H.R. Saunders, the English sculptor, and music under different teachers. I came to Indianapolis 4 years later and worked under Mr. Saunders on the groups placed on the Soldiers Monument. During this time, I went over to Crawfordsville and worked on busts and ornaments that were placed in General Lew Wallace's studio. I liked sculpture and had a measure of success in it. I never thought as much of it as I did of music, and I gave it up altogether. Sousa, when here in Indianapolis, heard me play on the cornet and engaged me at once. I made a tour with him and have continued in music as my chosen profession ever since.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know how it is. When you talk to the press, you make it sound smooth as silk, as if all the doors to my future were opening by magic. In truth, I had to work a little harder than I reported, but my talent won the way. So here is how it really went. I'd heard the afternoon Sousa concert in Indianapolis and then headed right over to Musicians Hall, where Sousa's musicians were eating lunch. I strode right in there and went straight up to Albert Bode, the first chair cornetist, and asked if he would give me a lesson. I don't know if they thought I was a rude amateur or just a plain rube. This sort of thing happens all the time, as I myself later learned. But I was persistent, and Mr. Bode right then and there took me to a locker room and asked me to play something.
From Bands of America, written by H.W. Schwartz. Kryl began playing portions of solos he was acquainted with. Outside the room, some other musicians were waiting to have their usual fun with the greenhorn. But when they heard the playing, one of them said, "My God, that can't be Bode playing. He never played like that in his life." Bode finally appeared in the hall to say, "That boy wants to take lessons from me." But hell, I can't teach him anything. He's better than I am.
What can I say? You may by now have decided that I have a high opinion of myself, but I was not the only one who did so, not by far. Still, my lack of experience showed. I was the featured cornetist, but I was still a boy from the old country.
Again, from Bands of America by H.W. Schwartz. Simone Mantilla and Arthur Pryor were in the Sousa Band when Kryl joined, and they often recalled the fun the older bandsmen had with the young bohemian when he arrived fresh from Indianapolis. Upon the occasion when the Sousa Band played in Buffalo, New York, Kryl expressed the desire to behold the wonders of Niagara Falls, which he had not yet visited. It so happened that the engagement was on a Sunday, and the men in the band convinced Kryl that the falls were turned off on the Sabbath. They said, however, that they knew the mayor of the city well, and they would intercede on Kryl's behalf to induce him to have the falls running on Sunday. When Kryl visited the falls and found them pouring forth in their spectacular glory, he was profoundly grateful to his associates for this favor.
Do you think that I was humbled when they let me in on the joke? I'm not saying. So there were episodes like this one, but I still loved being in the Sousa Band. For a year, that is, until I was painfully separated from it. I'm still bitter about this, as I told my former student and father of my great-grandchildren, Milan Jancic.
From An Orchestra Musician's Odyssey by Milan Jancic. Kryl had acquired a national reputation as one of the fine featured soloists, and he was looking forward to the international tour that Sousa was planning to make. Fate, in the form of the New York Musicians Union, thwarted his plans. It was one of the major disappointments of his life. The union had already chosen one of its own to be lead cornetist for the tour, and politics won out over talent. As a result of the union's unfair and unjust decision in denying him the opportunity for the Sousa World Tour, Kryl became one of the union's most inexorable foes. It was the beginning of a lifetime of hatred of the Musicians Union.
But by then, my talent was widely known, and demand for my services was not a problem. I played with Thomas Preston Brooks' band for the Louisiana Exposition in New Orleans. I played briefly with the Dust Band in Madison Square Gardens in New York. And then I got a wonderful offer I decided to take, and what a fortunate choice it was. When Fred Innes offered me the job as first cornetist in his band, I was on my way to my greatest fame as a cornet virtuoso.
From Bands of America. The first taste Kryl had of life with Innes was a 4-month transcontinental tour early in 1902, during which he faced over 150 audiences, for each of which he played an average of 2 program solos, plus several encores, an estimated total of over 600 solos for the tour. To the uninitiated, this heavy schedule would have come as a blow, but during Kryl's time with Brooke, he had come to regard such a man-killing schedule as normal. Kryl's spectacular solos on the cornet became the talk of the country and helped increase the drawing power of the Innes band. In 1903, to appease Kryl's mounting ego, Innes made him assistant conductor as well as premier soloist, and Kryl's name was carried in the advertising only a little smaller than the name of Innes. Kryl continued to be the most sensational single attraction in the band. Innes's band was at its peak and afforded Kryl the opportunity of playing before the greatest audiences of the times. Although he continued to solo with his own band for another 25 years, for sheer virtuosity, Kryl probably never excelled or equaled his phenomenal performances of this period.
With the Innis Band, I not only rose to virtuosic excellence as a cornet soloist, the wider world began to know my playing because I made commercial phonograph recordings. Some experts still say to this very day, no one has been able to equal my skill on the cornet. Of course, it is not for me to decide if this is true or not, but of course I do not mind being nominated. For your approval, I would like to submit this evidence in my favor.
Played by Bohumir Kryl in the Paarlberg.
No, you do not mean it. So I was not yet 30 years old and really at the top of my game. Now I could have fun. I think it was around 1904 when I began growing my hair long. This lion's mane became part of my signature. And I'm so pleased that this gentleman operating the phonographs on stage this evening has worn a lion's mane in my honor. Oh, the cartoonists had fun with that and with my mustache. I became a legendary figure, if I do say so myself. Once out in Nebraska in September of that year, 1904, what a great concert that was.
From the Lincoln, Nebraska Evening News. It remained for Bohumir Kryl in his rendition of Do Do with variations to arouse the audience to the highest pitch of enthusiasm. He has marvelous command of the instrument and, notwithstanding his display of technique, managed to preserve the lace-like delicacy of tone in the finer lilting passages. In response to the continued applause, he rendered Psyche and took the house by storm, and then the Carnival of Venice, in which he once more demonstrated his complete mastery of the instrument.
I tell you, dear guests at Wabash College, I was on fire in those years. The following spring in Los Angeles, the newspapers couldn't get enough of me.
From the Los Angeles Examiner, May 1905. The Examiner critic said, "About Kryl there is no question. Even without his wonderful mass of tangled flaxen hair, he would be a musical wonder. He is both artist and magician. Caruso of the Golden Voice might almost envy Kryl his artificial golden throat, for Kryl sings through his cornet with a rich, clean-cut tone that carries no suggestion of metal with it. The Daily Times critic went even farther. Kryl is a wonder, an instrumental freak. He began with Kryl's King Carnival, winding up with a skyrocketing note of a minute duration in Killarney the Ever Popular.
And I assure you, I was also unmatched in my humility. In 1906, it was time to leave Innis behind to make a new band, a better band, the best in the land. And so I did, Kryl's Bohemian Band. We made recording for Victor and others. By 1916, I was not only leading my band, but was also managing a number of other bands, a booking agency, and a music bureau. My friends, I will have to say that the magic name of Bohumir Kryl and my excellent gifts as a businessman brought all success to my enterprises. But things were about to change once again. If you're all good historians, you'll know that my great success came just as the Great War was beginning to tear Europe apart. When the United States was drawn in 1917, I stood fully ready to do my part. Just as John Philip Sousa had done for the Marines, I disbanded my band and reported to the U.S. Army, where I was appointed director of all military band camps and commissioned as a lieutenant. We bandsmen, now serving in the military, did not forget our loyalty to music itself. Now, I will admit that Sousa's Great Lakes Battalion Band was pretty good, but they could not compete with my band, which was formed by combining 3 field artillery bands, 4 infantry bands, and 1 band of regulars, comprising a total of approximately 250 players. What a magnificent sound. Finally, mercifully, the war ended. I was glad to see America and her allies conquer the enemy, and was even more relieved to see the end of the fighting. At one point during the war, I believed my beloved daughter Josephine, only 16 then, had been killed. She hadn't, thank heaven, and the return to peacetime allowed me to begin performing with her and her sister Marie. I had prepared both of them for the stage. You'll remember that I had become a father at quite a young age, especially given your modern standards. And by now my talented girls had grown up. Aren't they beautiful? Through the years, I invested my profits wisely, and they were plentiful, so I was able to assemble a personal art collection that became the envy of museums. I even became president of a bank. I was, how do you say it these days, a big shot. And I assure you, I loved every minute of it. But most importantly, I invested in music, and I invested in my family. I created the Kryl Symphony Orchestra and Kryl's Opera Company, and for my girls, I'm especially proud to say, the Kryl Women's Symphony Orchestra. Please realize, ladies and gentlemen, we now had 3 famous Kryls, and as a successful American entrepreneur, I could give my daughters a great many advantages. Alas, the press didn't quite understand.
From the Columbus Sunday Dispatch, November 5th, 1916. The edition of the Columbus Sunday Dispatch, a sensational tabloid newspaper, had a feature article with the headline, "Surely They Won't Be Old Maids," and followed with, "Here are 2 pretty girls who really don't know what love is. They never saw a movie or play, never read a novel, never kissed anyone but their father and mother, never danced, never had a boy or girlfriend, and never even had a doll." The tabloid piece went on to say, "They breathe of romance," says Papa Kryl, "but romance is not for girls who would carve out a career." So Papa Kryl censors all newspapers and magazines, deleting such stories with the aid of a big pair of scissors.
How could they not see? It was my job to raise my 2 princesses to become queens of the musical world. I encouraged them to postpone marriage to be sure that their careers were well launched. I did my very best to keep both Josephine and Marie wedded to their music. I even offered them the delectable prize of $100,000 if they would wait until age 30 to marry. Oh, I gave my daughters so much, and you will recognize that they were the jewels of my crown, these beautiful daughters. Josephine played violin and Marie played piano. They were so exceptionally gifted. They were able to perform on stage with me and also to perform as soloists with other highly renowned symphony orchestras. So it was that the Kryl name became a name to reckon with. I'm so very proud to say that one of Josephine's daughters, Pauni White-Jancic, is a highly gifted French horn player. Two of her children, Josephine's grandsons, Paul and Mark Jancic, are exceptionally talented principal timpanists for major orchestras in your 21st century. And that's just a bit of the musical talent among my descendants. I think it's quite fair to say that my wife Mary and I did indeed give the world a musical dynasty, and the newspapers be damned. No matter how great a mark I left on music and culture, at heart, I still held on to some of my immigrant ways. My youth had taught me the great virtue of frugality, and I never forgot it.
From In the Groove magazine, August 2012. Musicians who played in Kryl's band during the 20s have many stories about his frugality. According to these players, Kryl owned the uniforms of the band, and should a button be missing, Kryl took the replacement cost out of the man's weekly pay envelope. There were 30 men in the band, but only 20 railroad tickets would be purchased. The men were instructed that as soon as they boarded the train, they were to circulate up and down the cars so the conductor could not count them.
Is this true? I cannot recall. In any case, these matters were between me and my band members, and the newspapers can go on being damned. During my later years, I lived quietly, a champion of the arts to the extent of my ability. I lived to know my grandchildren and to watch their growing talent, and even taught a few of my great-grandchildren how to stand on their heads in true circus fashion. Alas, none of them gained any musical superpowers that way. It was a really fine life. I finally passed away at the age of 86. I dare say a handsome man still, on August 7, 1961, just a bit over 50 years ago. So a half-century has passed since I made my mark among you, and that's a fair amount of time. It pleases me that you have all gathered here in my name. Thank you. And in closing, I want you to know that I remember Indiana fondly, too. I came to Crawfordsville again 3 times. First in 1898 to play with John Philip Sousa's band, then in 1912 to play for a Chautauqua, and finally in the late 1940s for concerts at the Crawfordsville High School Auditorium. During that third visit, I came to the General Lew Wallace study, nearly 50 years after I'd worked there, and talked with Daisy Goodman, the curator at the time, about my work on the frieze. I'm moved and pleased that this little city is immortalized, partly because of me. Those friezes remind me of the dawn of my good, long life. May you enjoy them all for another century and more. As we get ready for the invigorating concert of my music, which we'll all soon hear, I would like to share with you one last phonograph recording that my daughters and I knew so well. it has been a pleasure spending a bit of time with you this evening. I hope you'll catch a whiff of my spirit when you hear the upcoming concert, coming just after a 10-minute intermission. Thank you for listening to this old man, and don't forget to pay special attention to the cornet player.